it shakes my confidence in how we think about those fallen soldiers. Now, I think one way to think about it and one way to situate it is that there was a constant learning process that occurred during the war. For the fighting forces, they learned to fight more effectively, combined arms warfare, the application of firepower, small unit tactics. For the medical services, as we've talked about, there was an evolution in medical treatment that saved lives. There were lectures behind the lines. John McCrae, the famous poet, was a medical officer. He was a great authority in teaching behind the lines, as were many others. They used these body parts as part of that teaching specimen and as samples. And yet, how could this have happened?
I want to start today with a number. 66,655. That's how many Canadians died in the First World War. 66,655 people. Sons, fathers, brothers, husbands. Farmers from Saskatchewan, steelworkers from Hamilton, teachers, students, fishermen, lawyers, Indigenous men who volunteered for a country that had not extended them full citizenship, recent immigrants who wanted to prove they belonged, teenagers who lied about their age. 66,000 of them went over there and didn't come home. We've spent more than 100 years trying to honor them. We build cenotaphs, we wear poppies, we stand in silence on November 11th, and we say their names when we can. We've tried, imperfectly but genuinely, to hold them in some kind of sacred trust, to say, you gave everything and we'll not forget what that cost. And that impulse, the desire to honor the fallen, is real. It's not just ceremony, it's something deep in the human contract. You take care of the dead, you leave them whole. Today's episode is about what happened when that contract was broken, not by the enemy, but by us. Welcome to the 25th episode of Memory and Valour, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the sacrifices of Canadian soldiers and veterans of the First World War. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae. Thank you for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. If Canadian history is important to you, follow this podcast wherever you stream, and please consider making a donation to this project by heading over to buymeacoffee.com and just search for Memory and Valor. You can choose from your most basic cup of black coffee or get fancy with a latte. I'd never refuse any kind of coffee, and your support really helps to keep the show going. So thank you in advance. And now, on with the show. So before I tell you what was done, I need you to understand the world in which it was done, because nothing about this story makes sense without context, and context is everything. The First World War broke medicine. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean that the nature and the scale of the wounds produced by industrial warfare in 1914 to 1918 so far exceeded anything the medical establishment had ever encountered that doctors were essentially starting from scratch. Textbooks were useless and training was inadequate. The surgery that worked in a civilian hospital back in Montreal or in Toronto was not the surgery that worked in a field dressing station 3 miles from the Somme. Think about what was happening to human bodies on the Western Front. You have high explosive artillery shells, which was the dominant killer of the war, fragmenting into jagged metal and driving that metal through flesh at velocities that produced wounds unlike anything a surgeon trained in the Victorian era had ever opened. You have poison gas, so chlorine, phosgene, mustard, burning and destroying lungs from the inside out in ways that were not fully understood. You have rifle bullets and machine gun bullets and mortar fragments and the concussive force of shell blasts that collapsed men's skulls and drove bone fragments deep into their brains. The men who survived these things needed medicine to reinvent itself, and fast. And it did. More than 20,000 Canadian doctors and nurses went overseas in the First World War. That was roughly half of everyone practicing medicine in Canada at the time. Half. The country essentially sent its entire medical profession to war. And what those doctors and nurses did over 4 years was, in many respects, extraordinary. Infection rates that had killed a majority of the wounded in every previous war were brought under control through advances in antiseptic technique and the management of wounds. So blood transfusions, still an experimental procedure at the start of the war, became routine. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was for the first time recognized as a genuine psychological injury rather than cowardice, at least by some doctors, some of the time. Facial reconstruction surgery, so plastic surgery in its modern form, was essentially invented in the hospitals behind the Western Front. Vastly more wounded men were saved than lost. In previous wars, disease had killed more soldiers than combat. In the First World War, the Canadian Medical Services reversed that ratio. This matters. It matters because the historian whose work underlies today's episode spent years making sure we understood this before he told us the other part of the story. And his name was Dr. Tim Cook. And I have spoken about him several times over several episodes. And just a heads up, I'm never going to stop because he was just fantastic. And he was the chief historian at the Canadian War Museum. He was Canada's foremost military historian and author of 19 books, I believe. His last major work, called Lifesavers and Body Snatchers, was published in 2022, and it took him more than a decade to research before he wrote this book. And as I've mentioned before, Tim Cook died on October 25th, 2025. He was 54 years old. He'd fought Hodgkin's disease, a cancer, for years while he was writing these books, and I think about that sometimes. A man researching how the sick and the dying were treated by the medical system of his own country while fighting his own illness. His work endures, and we owe him for doing it. He said this, and I think it's the most important framing for everything that follows. Quote, "I don't want the body snatcher's part to overwhelm the lifesaver's part, and yet there is a tension there. There are contradictions inherent in war, and there are no easy answers." End quote. So hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. Throughout this episode, we're going to hear from Dr. Tim Cook in his own words, in his own voice, just kind of peppered here and there throughout this episode. I wanted to share some of the things he talked about on December 19, 2022. He gave a talk at Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. And this was actually a book launch for the book we're referencing here today, and that is, again, Lifesavers and Body Snatchers. So throughout the episode, you will hear excerpts from that talk, and I won't necessarily introduce them every time because each clip is going to be Dr. Tim Cook giving his talk at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. Now, I want to spend a few more minutes with the doctors before we get to the thing they did. Because if you're going to understand it, not excuse it, understand it, you have to feel what they were dealing with. So imagine you're a Canadian surgeon. You trained in Montreal or Toronto or Winnipeg. You finished medical school in 1910 or 1912. You've seen difficult cases. You've done good work. And so you think you know what medicine looks like. And then you arrive at a casualty clearing station in Belgium. And within the first week, you've seen more catastrophic trauma than you will see in a lifetime of civilian practice. Men with their abdomens opened by shell fragments, their intestines exposed. Men with their faces literally caved in. The cheekbones, the jaw, the eye sockets, all of it destroyed by a bullet or a fragment or even the concussive force of an explosion, leaving them alive but in a state that the word disfigured does not begin to capture. Men whose lungs have been burned by chlorine gas who are drowning on dry land. Men whose legs have been shattered so completely that the femur, the strongest bone in the human body, is in pieces. And they're coming in by the hundreds, by the thousands on the bad days. The question the doctors had to answer was not just, how do I save this man? It was, how do I learn fast enough to save the next one? In peacetime, medicine learned through anatomy, through cadavers, through dissection and study of the dead, which had been the engine of medical knowledge since the Renaissance. Body snatching for the purpose of medical education was, for most of the 18th and 19th centuries, not just common, it was necessary. Medical schools needed corpses, and there were never enough legal ones. The Burke and Hare murders in Edinburgh in the 1820s happened precisely because anatomy schools were paying good money for fresh bodies and asking no questions. It took the British Anatomy Act of 1832 to begin formalizing the supply of bodies for study, and even then the trade in corpses continued in various forms for decades. By 1914, that tradition, learning from the dead to save the living, was woven into the foundations of how medicine understood itself. And the doctors at the front had the dead. They had them in terrible abundance. Here's what happened. Beginning in 1915, there was a formal, organized program, a British program adopted and carried out by Canadian medical officers to harvest body parts from fallen soldiers. Not secretly exactly. Not in the sense of trying to hide it from the men running the medical services. The orders went through proper channels. Doctors received instructions. Autopsies were conducted. Specimens were collected, preserved, cataloged. But not secretly in the sense that any soldier or any family was ever informed that this could happen. Not secretly in the sense that any consent was sought or given. The men who volunteered for the Canadian Expeditionary Force signed themselves over to the military, and in the context of the time, that meant something quite literal. Tim Cook put it plainly. When you enlisted in the First World War in the CEF, your body was essentially owned by the military. The concept of informed consent for soldiers, living or dead, was not part of the framework. It just didn't exist in any formal sense. So the program operated, and it operated on a significant scale. The body parts collected included brains, removed after deaths from head wounds, to study the nature of traumatic brain injury. They included lungs, removed from men killed by gas, to document what chlorine and phosgene and mustard actually did to respiratory tissue. They included bones, so femurs, tibias, and other skeletal elements shattered by bullets and fragments, preserved to teach surgeons what different projectiles did to the body at different velocities and angles. Organs, tissue samples, pathological specimens of almost every kind. And here's the number that Tim Cook confirmed after more than a decade in the archives: 799. So 799 individual body parts removed from dead Canadian soldiers and shipped to London, England, where they were received by the Royal College of Surgeons. They were treated and preserved and put on display in exhibition galleries as teaching specimens. 799. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because it's easy to let a number like that become abstract. These were not random biological specimens. Each one of those 799 items had a name, meaning that each one belonged to a man, a specific individual person who had a family somewhere in Canada who loved him and grieved him and never knew that this had been done to him. A mother who received a telegram saying her son had died for his country. She didn't know that before he was buried, someone had opened him up and taken something out, put it in a jar and sent it to London. And it didn't end in London. In 1918, before the war was even over, the first shipment of Canadian body parts was sent to Montreal. The plan was to establish a founding collection for a Canadian Medical War Museum, a permanent institution to be built in Ottawa. And while that permanent museum was never built, the specimens did come home. They were prepared, catalogued, and put on display. Canadian soldiers' body parts, the brains, the lungs, the shattered bones, were exhibited at medical conferences in Canada. And the person who made that happen was a woman. We'll get to her, because she deserves a segment of her own. I want to talk for a minute now about how Tim Cook found this story, because the way it was hidden is almost as revealing as the story itself. He spent more than a decade in the Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa working through the records of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, or the CAMC. And what he found, or rather what he had to find, was buried. Not shredded, not deliberately destroyed, but mislabeled, miscategorized, scattered across files that were not cross-referenced in any meaningful way. The records existed. The orders existed, the catalogs of specimens existed, but they were not organized in a way that would make them easy to find unless you were specifically looking for them. Cook said he had seen snippets of this in the letters and the diaries of doctors, small references, passing mentions in correspondence that made him think something was up, something was there. But when he went looking for the full picture, he had to essentially reassemble it from fragments. So this is not the same as a cover-up, but it raises a question worth asking. Why was this never part of the story we told ourselves about the medical war? The official history of Canadian medical services was written in 1925 by Sir Andrew MacPhail. He was a distinguished McGill professor and a war veteran. He knew these men. He had access to these records and this program. This 799 specimen program is nowhere in his account. Cook found no evidence of a deliberate decision to suppress it. What he found was something almost more troubling: institutional forgetting. Let's call it that. The slow, unconscious process by which uncomfortable history simply gets set aside year after year until it's buried not by intent but by accumulation of silence. And silence in its own way is a choice. The men running the medical services in the early 1920s clearly knew something had shifted in how Canadians thought about the bodies of the fallen. The planned permanent museum in Ottawa was never built. After 1920, there's no convincing evidence the specimens were publicly exhibited again. They didn't go on permanent display anywhere. They were maintained quietly at McGill in the care of one person, the woman who had prepared them, and then after her death, they simply vanished. Officials had begun to realize, Cook's words, that, quote, there was something very wrong here, that they should not have these body parts. It does not align with how Canadians are thinking about the sacred nature of the fallen, end quote. But they didn't tell anyone. They didn't notify the families. They didn't issue any formal acknowledgement. They simply let the subject drift off the edge of record. And it stayed there for 100 years until Tim Cook went looking.
When I found out that they were doing autopsies on slain soldiers behind the lines, and that isn't that strange. You know, the treatment of the dead and the fallen, our perception is, I think, they were killed in no man's land. They were left to rot. Sometimes if they died and they could be carried in, they were thrown into some mass grave and they were done. I just saw All Quiet on the Western Front on Netflix, and there's a whole bunch of mass graves going on there and not a lot of attention to the fallen or the dead. So autopsies, isn't that interesting that was happening? But as I looked at those records, it seemed to me to indicate that the doctors involved in those autopsies were also removing soldiers' organs. And I spent years looking through the records at the National Archives to find the files, to confirm that. I'm a historian, a fiction writer. We look for the evidence, and I found it eventually.
And that is a story that I have worked in. And here are two examples. A skull with a bullet hole through it that clearly shattered the skull and killed the soldier, and a heart with a rib puncturing it. So the wound passed through the soldier, broke his rib. The rib then became a secondary projectile, pierced his heart. These were removed from slain soldiers, cleaned in the case of the skull of skin and hair and the brain matter, and then put on display. This is a story that I tell in this book, and the Canadians were involved in it to the extent where 799 body parts were removed from British and Canadian soldiers and brought back to Canada after the war. That's never been told before.
Now, I know some of you are going to ask the same question I asked when I started researching this episode. Is there any first-hand account of this? Did any soldier write about it in a diary? Did any doctor describe it in a letter home? Is there a voice we can actually hear? The honest answer is complicated, and I think it's worth spending a few minutes on because the shape of the evidence, what exists, what doesn't, and why, is itself part of this story. So let's start with what you will not find. You will not find a private's diary entry that says, "They took Thompson's brain last night." That account doesn't exist. The men whose bodies were harvested were dead. The living soldiers around them were not present for autopsies conducted in medical units behind the lines. The program was institutional and it was invisible to ordinary infantrymen. Hundreds of CEF diaries survive, yes. The Canadian War Museum holds more than 250 of them, and they are vivid, detailed, heartbreaking documents of life and death in the trenches. But they end at the moment of death. What happened to the body afterwards simply wasn't something the living soldier could see or record. The absence isn't a gap in the research, it's a finding. It tells you something about how completely the program was conducted within the walls of the medical establishment, invisible to the men it affected. What you do find is the medical side of the record, and what's remarkable about it is not what the doctors hid, but what they published openly. Take Captain Lawrence J. Ray. That's spelled R-H-E-A. Ray was an experienced pathologist, and he was serving at No. 3 Canadian General Hospital, the McGill University Hospital unit, one of the most distinguished medical units the Canadians put into the field. He conducted hundreds of autopsies on slain soldiers, and he didn't hide this. He published his findings in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. He wrote matter-of-factly, quote, "We have held a post-mortem examination on most of the cases that have died in the wards of this unit." End quote. So in one study from early 1916, Ray removed the brains of 14 soldiers who had died as a result of shell fragments and used his findings to argue that steel helmets would have saved their lives. Canadian soldiers were issued steel helmets beginning in April 1916, so there is a direct line between this autopsy work and a policy change that saved lives. So I just want you to sit with the tone of that for a moment. We have held a post-mortem examination on most of the cases that have died in the wards of this unit. That is clinical, passive, and professional. There's no anguish in that sentence, and there's no acknowledgement that these were men with names and families. There is only the calm language of medical science doing what medical science does, opening the dead to learn their secrets. That's the closest thing we have to a first-hand account of this program from the inside. Not a confession, not a justification. It's just a doctor filing a report in the language of his profession about work that he understood to be entirely normal. And that, I think, is the most unsettling primary source of all. Not because Ray was a bad man, but because the flatness of his language, the complete absence of moral weight in his description of removing the brains of 14 dead soldiers, tells you more about the world these doctors lived in than any expression of guilt or hesitation could. There was no guilt, there was no hesitation, there was just work. The same tone runs through the Canadian Medical Association Journal and the Bulletin of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. That was a journal that began publication in 1918 specifically to share the lessons CAMC doctors were learning. These journals are full of doctors publishing their autopsy findings, reporting on gassed lungs, reporting on shattered femurs, and reporting on head wounds. All of it was in the calm professional register of men who understood themselves to be doing important scientific work. None of them wrote, "I wonder if we should be doing this." None of them wrote, "I thought about Private so-and-so's family today." Cook searched for that voice. He spent more than a decade looking. So he found snippets, passing references in letters and diaries that helped him triangulate what was happening, but he found no objections, no dissent, no recorded moment of doubt. The silence of the record on this point is uniform, and that uniformity is itself a primary source. It tells you what these men believed about their work, about the bodies in their care, about the line between the living soldier and the dead specimen. It tells you that for them, that line was not complicated. For us, 110 years later, it is.
I struggle with this in the book, of the act of using these soldiers as tools to be harvested. I wonder what the soldiers would have thought of that if they've known. I've never come across a soldier's letter where they talked about this program, so it doesn't appear to have been widely known to the soldiers. And yet, for doctors, they could go back to the Royal College of Surgeons in London, where the body parts were on display from mid-1917, and look at this, so widely known in the medical community. I come to grips with this. Next image, please. I talk about it in the book, and the movement at the end of the war of 799 of these body parts, not just to London, but the Canadians demand that they get their fair share, and those 800 body parts go back to Montreal. Again, how do we make sense of this, especially in a period after the war when we ennoble the fallen, when we build thousands of memorials across this country, where we say they died in a just cause? If you've read Jonathan Vance's book and you agree with it, which I do, where the soldiers are Christ-like figures who have died for us in this just war, where we erected stained glass windows in churches and wrote commemorative histories and had the poppy and had Armistice Day, renamed Remembrance Day in 1931, the local cenotaphs, the provincial cenotaphs, the national cenotaphs, the overseas cenotaphs. How do you square that with the understanding, the desire, the action of the medical services to take those same slain soldiers' body parts, who were called the sacred dead or the glorious dead, and to turn them into medical specimens? I struggle with that in the book. I struggle with that as I talk to you.
So I want to pull back from the institutional picture for a moment and think about who these men actually were, because this is a podcast called Memory and Valor, and I think we owe them that. The soldiers whose bodies were used in this program were not abstractions. They were young, most of them very young. The average age of a CEF soldier was around 23, and many were younger. They came from every corner of a country that was, in 1914, still finding its identity. Canada had only been a country for 47 years when the war began. Many of the men who enlisted were recent immigrants, British-born in many cases, Scottish-born like my great-grandfather, but also Ukrainian, Italian, Eastern European. Indigenous Canadians volunteered in significant numbers, something like 4,000 men, serving in a force under a flag that represented a government that had enacted policies designed to erase their cultures. They enlisted for all kinds of reasons. There was duty, adventure, economic necessity, social pressure, genuine patriotism, or fear of being seen as a coward, or just because their friends were going, or because a girl they liked had given a white feather to a man who didn't enlist. And for those who are not aware of the symbolism of the white feather, in the First World War, the women generally walked around carrying white feathers in their purses So if she's walking down the street going to the market and she sees a man walking down the street towards her who happens to be of age, she's wondering, why isn't he out, with my brother or with my husband on the battlefield in France? He's got to be a coward. And she would pull a white feather out of her purse and kind of wave it under his nose or shove it in his face, and for everybody on the street to see. So a lot of times that sent guys running over to the recruitment office too. They were told, and many believed, that their sacrifice would be honored and that they were serving something larger than themselves, that their deaths, if it came to that, would mean something. And then they died in mud, in barbed wire, in the dark, from bullets and gas and disease and wounds that wouldn't close. They died in aid stations or advanced dressing stations on the field, on operating tables, in hospital beds behind the lines. They died with their names on identification discs, also known as dog tags, and their service numbers in ledgers. They died as individuals, as specific people, and when they entered the machinery of military administration, which processed them the way any large institution processes the individuals who pass through it, it was done efficiently, impersonally, at scale. And in some cases, 799 cases that we know of, that machinery included a doctor with a surgical kit and a preserving jar.
The Germans, you'll remember, unleashed chlorine gas on the 22nd of April, 1915. They outnumbered the Canadians. They outgunned the Canadians. This is a famous painting by Richard Jack. This doesn't do justice to it. It's at the War Museum. It's 22 feet long. It's about 12 feet high. It's a very powerful piece, but it gives a sense of the battle and how it unfolds really over a 4-day period where the Canadians are fighting, being pushed back, but making the Germans pay for their assault over open ground. The wounds during the battle from modern weapons, however, were shocking in their brutality. Bullets and shrapnel ripped through flesh and organs, while high explosives dismembered bodies and collapsed internal organs. One frontline medical officer, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Watt, recounted the wounds to his fellow Canadians during the battle, and he wrote this: "It was one never-ending stream which lasted all day and night for 7 days without cessation. In all, some 5,200 cases passed through our hands." He was at a field ambulance. "Wounds here, wounds there, wounds everywhere," he wrote. "Legs, feet, hands missing, bleeding stumps controlled by rough tourniquets, large portions of the abdominal walls shot away, faces horribly mutilated, bones shattered to pieces, holes that you could put your clenched fist into."
I think about a specific case that Tim Cook mentioned. He's very careful with individual details, as a good historian is, but he described reading about a private who had been shot through the head. And this man didn't die immediately. He died 11 days later, probably in agony. And before he was buried, before his body was given whatever burial he received in whatever ground was available, his brain was removed. Cook said reading about that case haunted him. It haunted him because he had been researching the horrors of the First World War for his entire career and had, by his own account, become more callous than most people to what the war had done to human beings. And this still got to him. That's worth paying attention to. So now I want to shift gears and I want to tell you about a woman called Maud Abbott. Maud Elizabeth Seymour Abbott was born in 1868 in St. Andrews, East Quebec. Her mother died when she was 7 months old. Her father abandoned the family. She and her sister were raised by their maternal grandmother. She was homeschooled until she was 15 and then attended a private seminary school in Montreal, then applied to study medicine. McGill University in Montreal would not admit her, not because she wasn't qualified. She had graduated at the top of her class in arts. She was by any measure exceptional. McGill refused her because she was a woman. And McGill did not admit women to its medical faculty, and it would not do so until 1917, nearly 2 decades after Abbott had already built an international reputation in pathology without their permission. So she went to Bishop's College instead, earned her medical degree in 1894, went to Europe for postgraduate training, came back to Montreal, and applied to McGill again, not as a student this time, but as a researcher. They hired her as an assistant curator of the McGill Medical Museum in 1898. By 1901, she was curator, and over the next 4 decades, she built that museum into one of the most respected medical teaching collections in the world. She also became the world's leading authority on congenital heart disease. She's the only Canadian and the only woman in Diego Rivera's famous mural commemorating the innovators of cardiology. She co-founded the International Association of Medical Museums, the organization that today is called the International Academy of Pathology. She published the Atlas of Congenital Cardiac Disease in 1936, a text that shaped the field for a generation. She did all of this without ever being granted privileges to practice pathology at any Montreal hospital, because she was a woman. When the First World War began, Maud Abbott wanted to serve. She couldn't enlist. The military would not commission women as medical officers in the CAMC, only as nursing sisters. And Abbott was a pathologist and a museum curator, not a nurse, so she found another way. The Canadian Medical War Museum, the planned institution that would house the specimens harvested from fallen soldiers, needed someone to prepare and catalog the collection. Abbott took it on. She was the most qualified person in Canada to do it, possibly the most qualified person in the British Empire, and she knew it. She reported to a series of enlisted male physicians who, as one academic study later noted archly, had no expertise in museology whatsoever. She did the work, they held the rank. What she did with those specimens, though, was extraordinary in the technical sense of the word. She prepared them, she preserved them, she cataloged them with a meticulous care she brought to everything. She drafted the official descriptive catalog of the collection, a document that would have made the whole program legible to history, had anyone bothered to preserve it properly. And she arranged for the specimens to be exhibited. In November 1919, a symposium on the pathological specimens from France was held by the Montreal Medico-Surgical Society. The collection was presented. The Canadian Medical Association Journal gave it 12 pages of coverage. And in October 1920, when the American College of Surgeons held its annual meeting in Montreal, Abbott organized an exhibition of the full collection. The specimens, wax models, artwork, all of it. That stopped the conference in its tracks. The chair of the program committee wrote to her afterward, quote, "No one who ever attended a meeting of the American College of Surgeons has ever before seen anything like it, and the catalog you issued of all the exhibits was a perfect marvel to everybody." End quote. So let's think about that for a minute. 1920, Montreal. A room full of surgeons from across North America looking at the preserved remains of Canadian soldiers who had died in France. Brains, lungs, bones, organized and presented by a woman who had spent her career being told she wasn't qualified to hold the position her work had already made her qualified for. And I want you to think about what the men in that room were seeing. They were seeing the medical lessons of the war made visible. They were seeing what a gas attack does to a lung, what the shell fragment does to a femur, and what a head wound does to the brain. They were seeing it because Maud Abbott had made it possible for them to see it. The families of those soldiers were not in that room. They had not been told their loved ones' remains were there. They did not know that what had been extracted from the bodies of their sons and husbands and brothers was now on display at a medical conference in downtown Montreal. After 1920, the collection was never publicly exhibited again. The permanent museum in Ottawa, the one that was supposed to give all of this a home, was never built. The collection stayed at McGill in Abbott's care. She maintained it for the rest of her life. And just a side note, there are photographs that exist of the exhibition that was used at that conference. In Tim Cook's book, those photographs are printed and available. Maud Abbott died on September 2nd, 1940, of a cerebral hemorrhage. She was 72 years old. After her death, the collection disappeared. Not dramatically or all at once, it just simply ceased to be tracked. The specimens weren't transferred to any official archive. They were not returned to the Royal College of Surgeons. They weren't buried. They weren't destroyed. As far as anyone knows, they were simply lost, bureaucratically lost, as one historian put it. The Canadian War Museum, contacted by researchers decades later, confirmed that they were aware the collection had once existed but had never seen it. The Maud Abbott Medical Museum at McGill had none of the specimens. The Canadian Forces Health Services had never even heard of it. A collection of nearly 900 specimens, the preserved remains of Canadian soldiers carefully prepared over decades by one of the most meticulous medical museum curators who ever lived, had simply ceased to exist in any locatable sense. Because the one person who knew where everything was had died, and nobody had thought to ask her while she was alive.
This is an image of the exhibition of the body parts in Montreal. I know I have the catalog. These are bone samples that have been removed from soldiers' femurs and skulls and other things. These are plaster hands that have been horribly wounded, and the reconstruction of hands. Often burned hands become claw-like. We know that from Second World War, especially in airmen and troopers. They were doing experimental work. These are facial wounds, facial reconstruction. On the other side of this are the wet samples, which are the organs. When I saw this, when I found this image, one of those moments, and they happen to all researchers, where you sometimes find something and you're at the National Archives, you can hear it. It's great. Someone goes, yeah, or goddamn, I got it, honey, come on over. Finding someone in the census, it's a great thing. Part of being a historian is being a detective. Those moments don't happen too often. And there's darker moments, like this one when I found this, another confirmation that these body parts had been removed and sent back to Canada. What also came back to Canada were the lessons of the war. Again, remember, half of all Canadian doctors served overseas. One of them wrote after the war gave us a new social conscience. One of the ways that this was revealed through a new focus on public health. There was a new state medical system for veterans. A Department of Health was established in 1919. Physiotherapy was advanced during the course of the war. Blood transfusions I've talked about, X-ray machines, the plastic surgery, all advanced during the course of the war. Even an emphasis on maternal health, which is really interesting, I think. Emerging from the war, the 60,000 dead, or 66,000 by 1922, they're talking openly how we need to save babies' lives to help replace the soldiers we've lost overseas. There's other aspects to this, including Nick Clark's work on the 100,000 Canadians or so who were turned down from enlistment because they were too malnourished to serve.
So I kind of think that Maud Abbott deserves more than a footnote in this story. She was a woman who was systematically excluded from the full practice of medicine by institutions that were happy to use her expertise without properly crediting or compensating her for it. And she was the person who did more than anyone to give the Canadian Medical War Museum its form, who prepared the specimens, cataloged them, exhibited them, maintained them for 20 years, and who was never properly credited for any of it. The Canadian Medical Hall of Fame inducted her posthumously in 1994. The Medical Museum at McGill now bears her name. The Congenital Heart Disease Clinic at McGill University Health Centre is called the Maud Clinic. None of that happened while she was alive. There's something in that, in the fact that the person who did the most to preserve and exhibit the remains of these soldiers was herself someone whose contributions were systematically undervalued by the institutions she served, and that feels like part of the same story. The soldiers whose bodies were used without consent, the woman whose labor was used without full acknowledgement, the state that extracted what it needed from both and then moved on. Now, I want to say something uncomfortable, and I need to say this carefully because I think it's important. The doctors who did this were not monsters, and I want to be clear about that because it would be easy and wrong to simply cast them as villains and move on. The men of the CAMC were, for the most part, genuinely dedicated to saving lives. They were operating under extraordinary pressure with inadequate resources in conditions that would probably have broken most people. They'd volunteered in many cases for service that was neither glamorous nor safe. Medical personnel were killed and wounded throughout the war. They weren't civilians standing safely at a distance from the dying. They were right in the middle of it, and they believed sincerely that what they were doing with these specimens was contributing to medical knowledge that would save lives, not just in this war, in the next one, in civilian hospitals in the future. The logic wasn't irrational. The study of pathological specimens of what disease and injury actually do to the human body at the tissue level was and remains a foundational part of medical education. You can't fully understand what a gas attack does to the lungs without looking at lungs that have been gassed. You can't understand the mechanics of traumatic brain injury without studying brains that have been traumatically injured. The specimens at the Royal College of Surgeons weren't decorative. They were educational tools, and they were used as such. Cook ultimately concludes that the extractions were not worth it. He says plainly that there were other ways to learn, but he also acknowledges the genuine complexity of the position these doctors were in, and the genuine good faith, however misguided and however unexamined, with which many of them acted. The thing that troubles me, and I keep coming back to, is not that the doctors did it. In the context of their time and their circumstances, I can see how it happened. What troubles me is the tone in which they did it. I mentioned Captain Ray earlier, the pathologist who published his autopsy findings in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, who removed the brains of the 14 soldiers to study helmet design. His language in those published reports is completely flat and clinical and undisturbed. There's no sense that he understood himself to be doing something that required moral justification. It's like there's no weight in his sentences. It's just a doctor doing work. That's the voice of this program. Not anguished, not conflicted, just professional. And I think that flatness tells you more about what these men believed, about soldiers' bodies, about military property, and the line between a person and a specimen, than any amount of explicit justification could. The silence in that record tells us that the bodies of these men were so completely categorized as military property, as resources to be used in the service of the war effort, that the idea of their having any claim to dignity or integrity after death simply didn't register, or if it did, it didn't register loudly enough for anyone to write it down. So, okay, let's sit with the ethics of this for a while, because that's really what this episode is about. The factual record is what it is. Tim Cook spent a decade in the archives establishing it. 799 body parts, British program, Canadian adoption, Royal College of Surgeons in London, planned museum in Ottawa that was never built. That's the history. The question is what we make of it. And I want to approach that question from a few different angles, because I don't think there's one clean answer. And if there were, I think Tim Cook would have given it to us. And he specifically said he didn't have one. So let me start with the most fundamental question, and that is, what are the dead owed? This isn't a new question. Philosophers have been arguing about it for thousands of years. There's a school of thought, sometimes called the no subject view, that says the dead aren't owed anything because the dead don't exist as subjects anymore. They can't be harmed. They can't experience dignity or indignity. A corpse is just matter. What difference does it make what you do with it? I find that view technically defensible and profoundly unconvincing. I think most people do, which is why we don't act on it. We have funeral rites, we have grave markers, we have laws protecting cemeteries. We have deep, almost universal intentions that the dead deserve something, not because they can feel it, but because we can. Because how we treat the dead says something about who we are and about the value we place on the lives that produced those bodies. And I think that that whole universal intuition is the driving force behind this project of mine, this Memory and Valor podcast, the website, the books. When we honor the dead, we're not doing it for them, we're doing it for ourselves. We are affirming that these lives mattered, that these people were not just resources to be consumed and discarded by the systems they served, that even after death, the covenant between a person and their community persists. The Canadian Expeditionary Force soldiers who were harvested in this program died serving their country. Their country had extracted from them the ultimate price, and then, in some cases, it extracted a little more, quietly, without record, and without asking. That feels like a betrayal of the covenant, even accounting for the historical context, even accounting for the genuine medical purpose, even accounting for the fact that no one at the time seems to have thought twice about it. It still feels like something that shouldn't have been done. But here is the harder question, the one that keeps me up at night far more than the simpler moral outrage does. These men enlisted. They signed up. They volunteered. They handed themselves over body and soul, and I mean that almost literally, to the Canadian military. They accepted by doing so that their lives could be spent in service of military objectives, that they could be sent to places where they would almost certainly be wounded and might very well be killed. We honor that as a form of sacrifice. We call it valor. So here's the question. Is the harvesting of their body parts after death categorically different from the spending of their bodies in combat? Or is it in some uncomfortable way a continuation of the same logic? I think it's different. And I want to explain why, because the distinction matters. When a soldier goes into battle and is killed, the risk to his body is disclosed. It is, in a deeply terrible sense, the point. Everyone understands, the soldier, the military, the family, that combat involves mortal danger. The soldier accepts that risk as part of his service. That sacrifice, however brutal, happens with something like consent built into the structure of enlistment. What happened to these 799 men was different. They had not been told that their bodies might be opened up on an operating table after their deaths and their organs removed and sent to London for a display. That was not part of what they understood themselves to be signing up for. The risk they accepted was the risk of death, not the risk of what came after. And that gap between what they consented to and what was done is where the ethical failure lives. Now, I know some people will push back on this. They'll say consent frameworks didn't exist the same way in 1914. They'll say the military ownership of a soldier's body was recognized as legal and social norm. They'll say we can't judge the past by the standards of the present. And all of that is true. I am not saying the doctors were criminals. I'm not saying anyone should have been charged with anything. I'm saying that the question of what these men were owed, the question we're asking 110 years later, has an answer. And the answer is more than they got. There's one more dimension to this, and I don't think it gets enough attention, and it's this. The families. Think about what it was like to be the mother or the wife of one of these men. You received a telegram, official regrets, killed in action, or died of wounds, or died in hospital. You grieved. You maybe received a personal effects package which contained maybe a watch, a wallet, some letters. You tried to picture where he was buried, whether there was a grave marker, whether someone had said some words over him. you build a picture of what had happened to him, and that picture, however incomplete, however painful, was the thing you held on to. And somewhere in that picture, in every case, was the assumption that his body had been treated with some degree of respect. Not because you had any reason to think otherwise, but because that's the covenant. He gave his life. You trusted that in return he would be treated as a human being and not as a resource. For 799 families, that assumption was wrong, and they were never told. I don't know what telling them would have looked like, practically speaking. I don't know whether in the 1920s it would have been possible to trace the specimen in the jar back to the name in the ledger and then to the family in Ontario or Alberta or Nova Scotia. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe the records were never complete enough for that. But the question of whether it was possible to notify the families is separate from the question of whether someone tried. And from everything Dr. Tim Cook found, nobody tried. The decision not to build the museum, the decision that implicitly acknowledged something had gone wrong, was a quiet decision made in bureaucratic rooms, never announced, never explained, never accompanied by any attempt at accountability. So the families never got to be angry. They never got to grieve this specific thing because they weren't given the chance. So the silence was its own harm. I said earlier that officials in the 1920s had begun to realize something was wrong, that the planned museum was quietly abandoned, that the body parts were not publicly displayed, that the story drifted off the record. And so I want to be precise about what kind of moral development that was and what it wasn't. It wasn't a reckoning, it was a discomfort. There is a meaningful difference between the two. A reckoning involves looking directly at what was done, naming it, acknowledging those who were wronged, and taking some form of action in response. A discomfort involves sensing that something is off, quietly adjusting course, and hoping that nobody looks too closely. What happened in the 1920s was the latter. It was the second thing. So the people who made the decision to abandon the museum weren't wrong to sense that public display of these specimens was inappropriate. Their instinct was correct. But instinct without accountability is just convenience. You don't get credit for quietly correcting a mistake if the people you wronged, or the families, never know the mistake was made or even corrected. What would a real reckoning have looked like? Probably something like what Cook himself did. Going into the records, finding the truth, naming it clearly and publicly, and trusting that Canadians could handle knowing it. His book was published in 2022. It won awards. It was reviewed in the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star and covered by CBC. Canadians could handle it. They always could have. The question of why it took 100 years for someone to go looking, why this story was never part of the official history, never part of how we taught the First World War in schools, never part of the story we told at Remembrance Day ceremonies, that's a question worth sitting with, I think. And I think the answer has something to do with the particular way we have chosen to remember that war. The dominant narrative of the First World War, in Canada especially, is one of sacrifice and national becoming. Vimy Ridge as the birth of a nation. The Canadian Corps as hard-edged, world-class fighting force that came from nowhere and proved something. The fallen as heroes. That narrative isn't wrong, but it's incomplete, and the parts it leaves out tend to be the parts that complicate the story. The shell shock that was sometimes treated as cowardice, the executions for desertion, the use of soldiers' bodies as medical specimens without their knowledge or consent. We tell the story we can live with, and then sometimes a historian comes along and tells us the parts we've left out. So again, the reckoning that happened in the 1920s wasn't really a reckoning, it was a discomfort, and I meant that. But I want to update that part of the story because something happened in March of 2026, last month, that changes the picture. The partial remains of 12 Canadian soldiers from the First World War were returned to Canada, repatriated by the Mutter Museum and Historical Medical Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Here's how they got to Philadelphia. The soldiers had been patients at Pennsylvania Base Hospital Number 10, which was an American military hospital located in Le Tréport, France. More than 100 samples were collected there by American medical personnel. The same kind of program Tim Cook documented on the Canadian side, carried out by American doctors serving alongside the Allies. In 1919, those samples were transported to the Mutter Museum for further study. They sat there for more than 100 years. So the Mutter Museum, for those who don't know it, is a medical history museum in Philadelphia that has long held one of the most significant collections of pathological specimens in North America. It's a serious institution. And in recent years, it's been doing what many such institutions are now doing, and that is examining its collection, asking hard questions about how specimens were acquired, and beginning the process of returning remains to their communities of origin. The Canadian Armed Forces has been part of an international effort led by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, involving Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom to reclaim these remains and honor the soldiers. Of the 12 Canadian soldiers identified as part of the study, 10 died of their injuries and are buried at Mont-Huon Military Cemetery in Le Tréport, France. 2 survived the war and are buried elsewhere. The partial remains will be interred in the graves of the soldiers from whom they were taken. I want to read you their names because that's the whole point, isn't it? These were not specimens. These were men. So let's start locally. Sergeant Martin James Murphy, born January 2nd, 1885, died September 18, 1918, enlisted in Edmonton, Alberta, 4th Battalion, Canadian Machine Gun Corps. Private Charles Arthur Boyce, born August 7th, 1874, died December 6, 1917, enlisted in Edmonton, Alberta, 10th Battalion, CEF. Private Edward Lee, born March 29, 1883, died August 29, 1917, enlisted in Vancouver, British Columbia, 7th Battalion, CEF. Private Charles Lorne Parkin, born November 24, 1896, died September 9th, 1918, enlisted in Caledonia, Ontario, 1st Battalion, CEF. Private Somerville McPherson, born November 10, 1886, died August 17, 1918, enlisted in Vernon, British Columbia, 47th Battalion, CEF. Private Fred James Williams, born December 6, 1874, died October 3, 1918, enlisted in Windsor, Ontario, 18th Battalion, CEF. Private John Kincaid, born December 11th, 1898, died October 1st, 1918, enlisted in Toronto, Ontario, 58th Battalion, CEF. Corporal Frank Jancy, born July 25th, 1896, died August 22nd, 1918, enlisted in Fort Frances, Ontario, 4th Battalion, CEF. Corporal John Kincaid, born June 27, 1890, died September 11, 1918, enlisted in Kingston, Ontario, 58th Battalion, Canadian Field Artillery. Sergeant Thomas William Jones, born June 11, 1875, died October 15, 1918, enlisted in Kingston, Ontario, 9th Brigade, Canadian Field Artillery. And the 2 who survived the war, men who came home, who lived their lives, who are nonetheless part of this story. Private Kenneth Dougal Crawford, 192nd Battalion, CEF, and Private Norman McNeil, 189th Battalion, CEF. I find something almost unbearably moving about that list. These are not categories, they're not specimens. These are men with birthdays and hometowns and battalion numbers. Men who enlisted right here in Edmonton and Kingston and Fort Frances. Men who died in France in the terrible autumn of 1918 when the war was almost over but not quite over enough for them. And now, in 2026, their partial remains are being returned to their graves more than a century after they were taken. The Canadian Armed Forces put out a statement about the repatriation, and part of it read, quote, "Today, our priority is to always honor those who serve Canada and to treat those who paid the ultimate sacrifice with dignity and respect." End quote. That statement is true. And I also want to sit with the gap between that statement and what happened in 1919 when those remains were shipped to Philadelphia, because acknowledging that standards have evolved, which is what the CAF statement is doing, carefully and diplomatically, is not the same as saying we were wrong, we're sorry, these men were owed more. The repatriation is the right thing to do. The Valour Museum is doing the right thing by dismantling this collection and returning these remains. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission is doing the right thing by leading the international effort. All of that is true and worth saying. But I notice that nowhere in the official language around this is the word apology. I notice that the framing is about evolving standards rather than historical wrong. And I notice that the families of these 12 men, if any of them even knew this was happening, if any descendants were traced and notified, are being asked to accept the return of partial remains to graves that have sat in France for more than 100 years, with no full accounting of what was done and why. This is better than nothing. It is significantly better than nothing, but it's not yet the full reckoning. What the Valour Museum story does, and this is important, is confirm that what Tim Cook documented on the Canadian side was not an isolated Canadian phenomenon. This was a practice carried out across Allied medical establishments. British, Canadian, American doctors were all part of the same system, all operating under the same logic and harvesting specimens from men who had zero say in the matter. The scale of it is still being mapped. The 12 Canadians at the Valour are 12 we know about from one American hospital in one French town. Tim Cook's 799 are from Canadian medical units across the Western Front. So how many more are there? In how many collections? In how many museums and medical libraries and university anatomy departments around the world? We don't fully know. And that is itself kind of an answer. Let me come back to the question Tim Cook asked himself, and that I think we have to ask too. Was it worth it? The medical advances of the First World War were real and significant. The lessons learned about wound management, about infections, surgery, the psychological effects of combat, these lessons shaped medicine for decades. The doctors and nurses who served in the CAMC came home and built the medical infrastructure of modern Canada. The Canadian Department of Health was created in 1919, partly as a direct result of what the war had taught about our public health. The knowledge gained from studying gassed lungs and shattered bones contributed to the understanding of those injuries in subsequent conflicts and in civilian practice. And some portion of that knowledge, we don't know exactly how much, and it's genuinely hard to quantify, came from those 799 specimens. So was it worth it? Tim Cook said no. He said there were other ways to learn, and I think he's right, even if I also think it's pretty complicated. And here's why I say it's complicated. The alternatives in the context of 1915 and 1916 were not always obvious or available. Cadavers from civilian sources weren't available at the front. The pace of learning required by the scale of casualties meant that doctors couldn't wait for conventional medical research to catch up. The pressure to understand fast what was happening to these bodies so that the next man in could be treated more effectively was genuine and urgent. But here's why I ultimately agree with Cook. The men whose bodies were used had not agreed to be used this way. And the argument that we needed the knowledge is an argument that can justify almost anything if you're not careful. It's the same logic that underlies some of the darkest chapters in the history of medicine. Experiments conducted on people who didn't consent in the name of knowledge that would, theoretically, benefit others. The men whose bodies they used were already dead. By the underlying logic, that the needs of the many outweigh the bodily integrity of the individual without asking the individual is the same logic. And it's a logic that medicine has, over the past century, rightly learned to be very suspicious of. Consent is not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It's not red tape. It's the recognition that individuals have a claim on their own bodies and, in some meaningful sense, on what becomes of those bodies. That cannot simply be overridden by institutional needs, however genuine. We understand that now better than we did in 1915. But understanding it now doesn't mean we can't look at what happened then and say, this was wrong. These men were owed more than this. The fact that no one thought so at the time doesn't make it right. It just makes it a thing of its time, which is what most historical wrongs are. So, at the end of the day, or at 3 a.m., what do we do with all of this? I've been sitting with this story for a while now, and I'll be honest with you, there just doesn't seem to be a clean resolution. There's no moment where you can say, and then they made it right. There's no apology, there's no formal acknowledgement, and no process of reconciliation with families. There's just the history, finally told, 100 years late. Tim Cook was careful about what he wanted people to take from his book, Lifesavers and Body Snatchers. He didn't want the body snatchers to swallow the lifesavers. He didn't want the genuine heroism and dedication of the Canadian medical services to be erased by this uncomfortable truth about what those same services had done. He held both things at once throughout the book, the way you have to hold most complicated history with both hands without letting either side go. And I think that's the right approach. The doctors and nurses who served in the CAMC saved tens of thousands of lives. That is real. That matters. The story of what Canadian medicine did in the First World War is, in many respects, a story of remarkable human courage and ingenuity under conditions of almost unimaginable pressure. And also, 799 men had their bodies used in ways they never consented to, and their families were never told, and the state quietly looked the other way when it realized what it had done, and then nobody said anything for 100 years. So both of those things are true, and pretending either one doesn't exist doesn't serve anyone, least of all the men who died. What strikes me most at the end of all of this is something about the nature of memory. We talk a lot in this country about honoring the fallen. We have a whole infrastructure of remembrance. The cenotaphs, the poppies, the 2 minutes of silence, the political speeches every November. And I believe in that infrastructure. I think it serves a genuine purpose. But I think genuine remembrance, the kind that actually honors the dead rather than just making us feel better about having honored them or having attended a remembrance ceremony, has to include the uncomfortable parts, the full picture, the things that were done to these men that we'd prefer not to think about, the gaps between the official story and the reality. Tim Cook went into the archives because he believed Canadians could handle the truth about their history, and I think he was right. And I think the 12 men whose names I read earlier in this episode, Murphy, Boyce, Lee, Parkin, McPherson, Williams, Kincaid, Jancy, Kincaid, Jones, Crawford, McNeil, they deserve to have their names read. Not just entered into a ledger and filed away, read out loud by someone who knows why they matter. The least we can do for the 66,000 men who didn't come home and for the hundreds whose bodies were harvested after death is handle it, to know about it, to say, this happened. These were real men. They were owed more than they got. And then to carry that with us, along with the rest of what we carry, when we stand at the cenotaph in November.
And I'll end just with a final thought on Canada's most famous doctor of the war, Jack McCrae, as he was known to his friends, John McCrae, who wrote the famous poem in Flanders Fields. The poem outlived him, of course. He died in January of 1918 from meningitis, many thinking having worked himself to death. The poem lives on. I always think it's interesting when people write about the poem. John is sort of seen as this prophet of peace. It's a very martial poem. It was written in 1915. He hated the Germans. He was a firm supporter of the war, and yet he was a man of medicine. And he treated Canadians and British and Indian soldiers and French and Germans as well. The poem, I think, is fascinating. We think of it as a poem of commemoration to ensure the memory of the dead and the fallen is kept alive, the torch that is passed. And yet, McCrae was first and foremost a doctor. And in one of his last lectures to fellow doctors, he was a very famous doctor, he lectured all across the Western Front. He said, when I go back to Canada, my greatest legacy will not be the poem, will be to ensure that Canadians have better public health. That is what he saw as his legacy and lesson. That was the torch he hoped to throw to Canadians. He didn't live to do that, but his fellow doctors and nurses did. Thank you very much.
So thank you for joining me for this episode of Memory and Valor. And I know it was a difficult one. And my guess is that a lot of you guys out there who are listening probably weren't aware of what went on in this respect in the latter part of the First World War. I certainly didn't know anything about this until I picked up Cook's book, Lifesavers and Body Snatchers, a couple of years ago, and I was shocked. But at the same time, I also felt really empowered. It was good to know that this happened. I think that's part of reconciliation, and I think it's part of honoring our fallen. The truth is a super important part of remembrance. So again, thank you for being here with me today. I appreciate the time that you've spent with me. And remember to keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.